I'm Biresh Banerjee. Welcome. We start in the Gazan city of Khan Yunis, where authorities say a school sheltering children has been damaged after an Israeli airstrike. Video obtained by the Reuters news agency shows the moment of impact, sending sparks flying and clouds of smoke billowing into the night sky. Witnesses say the blast shattered windows and tore through walls in the neighboring building, a school run by the UN refugee agency UNRWA, currently housing displaced people. A resident said people sheltering there had received a call moments earlier warning them of the strike, giving them just enough time to get to safety. There are no reports of casualties. And after 8.5 months of war in Gaza, Israel still says it plans to destroy Hamas. But there was a remarkable quote from the spokesman of the Israeli army in an interview. Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari told Israel's Channel 13 broadcaster, and I quote, "To say that we are going to make Hamas disappear is to throw sand in people's eyes. If we don't provide an alternative, in the end, we will be left with Hamas." He further said, "Hamas is an ideology. We cannot eliminate an ideology," unquote. Now, Hamas is classified as a terrorist group by many Western countries. In addition to its military wing, it has governed Gaza since 2007 and is a political force as well. Let's take a look at what's left of the group and the danger it could still pose to Israel.
Hamas fighters firing rockets at Israel from southern Lebanon, where it cooperates with other militant groups. Air raid alarms are frequent in Tel Aviv, well within those rockets' range. This is something Israel's military wanted to stop with its war in Gaza, yet it's still happening. There are no precise, independently verified figures available about Hamas's strength in numbers of fighters or its stocks of weapons. Israel estimates that Hamas had more than 30,000 fighters at the time of its terror attacks on October 7th last year, and that between 12 and 14,000 have been killed in fighting since then. However, Hamas may be able to fill its ranks with new recruits quickly. Israel has also seized stores of weaponry, including rocket launchers, missiles, and guns. An Israeli military analyst told DW earlier this year that 70 to 80% of Hamas's arsenal had been captured or destroyed. But about half of Hamas's tunnels are estimated to still be intact, allowing the group to hide, regroup, and potentially rearm itself through its smuggling network. Then there's the group's leadership, which has largely survived. Yahya Sinwar, the group's leader in Gaza, still runs operations from hiding, and the group's political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, is in Qatar. The leader of the military wing, Mohammed Deif, is thought to be hiding in Gaza as well. Israel did kill Deif's deputy, Marwan Issa, but that is the closest it's come to taking out the senior leadership. As Israel reckons with a war that could go on for months to come, pressure for a ceasefire is growing. Otherwise, its forces may be overstretched and less able to react to other threats.
Let's get more now from Middle East expert Daniel Gerlach, who joins me now from Tokyo. Daniel, good to see you. Israeli military spokesman Daniel Hagari says, and I quote, "To say that we are going to make Hamas disappear is to throw sand in people's eyes," unquote. What has the Israeli military been doing in Gaza, if not trying to make Hamas disappear?
Yeah, the problem is that sometimes numbers become meaningless when there's no political strategy. And I think what Daniel Hagari and also Chief of Staff Herzia Levi wanted to say, and they've been trading, let's say, unfriendly words, even with the Netanyahu government for a few days now, is if there's no political strategy, the military cannot be expected to achieve political goals. And the future of the administration of the Gaza Strip is a political, not a military issue. Hamas has a military wing, but the problem is that Israeli forces, upon command of their political leadership, targeted everyone who was affiliated with Hamas. And that pertains also to people who do policing and to uphold administration and a certain degree of public order. So if you destroy all of this, then you can say, of course, you have killed many Hamas people, and some estimates, like let's say optimistic, cynically said estimates of the Israeli armed forces, that they had killed up to 15,000 Hamas members, that they had killed like half of the battalion commanders of the 24 battalions. But nevertheless, there is still an infrastructure in place, and there is still a lot of people affiliated with Hamas. So if you don't have a political strategy how to deal with this issue, other than military, then of course this is doomed to fail. And then what we see is that political leadership tends to accuse the generals of weak performance. I think the Israeli forces are not to be blamed for that, at least.
The IDF was working on the government's orders. Are you saying that the government and the IDF are not on the same page anymore?
Well, there are clear signs for this. You can see that in the past, Israel has a democratic system and a democratic army in a sense. So though the armed forces have been heavily infiltrated and undermined by non-secular right-wing extremist forces, and that also, of course, has an impact on the leadership in the army tries to still, keep some reason in place. And though the army has been accused, I think rightfully in part, of not exerting the necessary control, of also allowing war crimes to happen, the army tried to achieve a military goal, which is the destruction of Hamas. Now, we even see that the army is no longer pursuing the goal of liberating the hostages, at least. That might be the task of a few special forces of the border police, but not the core, let's say, target of the army operation in the south of the Gaza Strip. And I see a lot of disagreement between the Netanyahu government and the army. But the only problem is Netanyahu is in this situation willing to accuse everyone of treason, to attack everyone around him, even those that have been serving him quite committedly.
Daniel Hagari was also talking about providing an alternative to Hamas in the end. Is this the military also saying that this is something that the government is ignoring?
Well, it seems so. Let's remember that Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant said that weeks ago, and he cannot be accused of being, illoyal to the government. He was like hardcore. He was really like adamant when it comes to the destruction of Hamas. But he told Netanyahu, and he said it publicly, you have to come up with a plan. And you have to probably also reach out to the Arab states if you want to settle this issue. And you have to do it while the war is ongoing. It doesn't make sense to hope for an end of the war and then deal with the issue. You had opposition politician Benny Gantz, who left the war cabinet a few days ago. And ultimately, the war cabinet was resolved upon an ultimatum that had expired, that he had said to Netanyahu, asking him, come up with a political plan. Netanyahu has done nothing of that. And of course, we hear here and there scenarios and plans like trickling down. But in fact, there is no tangible issue. And you cannot expect any force, let alone the Arabs, to join and to support you on whatever endeavor it is to secure the future of the Gaza Strip if you don't have any political scenario for the future of it. And then you have members of the government who say we need to resettle the Gaza Strip, we need to send, establish settlements in the Gaza Strip and annex it forever. And of course, that is not very encouraging to anyone who wants to play a conducive role to peace and security.
Middle East expert Daniel Gerlach there. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Well, joined here in the studio by Gil Murciano. He is the CEO of MITVIM, that's the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policy. Gil, let me just quote here, to say that we are going to make Hamas disappear is to throw sand in people's eyes. How important is this statement coming from one of the Israeli military's most important spokespeople?
Indeed, quite a rare expression of protest coming from the professional level in Israel, from the IDF. In many ways expressing or reflecting a great frustration by the IDF. We are talking about the IDF reaching a certain level of military achievement when it comes to reducing Hamas military capability, but with the clear understanding that from now on, the real operation of defeating Hamas is more of a political, diplomatic a mission than a military mission altogether.
But many people have said that from the beginning. You cannot completely destroy Hamas, and yet the Israeli government and also the military has said, we will destroy Hamas. Doesn't all this come a bit late?
Well, I think that right now, when we're speaking about defeating Hamas, we need to speak specifically about the goal of basically removing Hamas as a governing unit in Gaza on the day after. And therefore, the major discussion is about an alternative, creating an alternative to Hamas. And this is a political discussion that mainly refers to the return of the PA. Now, the Israeli government, because of its own political limitation, has been unable or unwilling to even discuss the option. Netanyahu was talking about not replacing Hamastan with Fatahstan, with the movement that Abu Mazen is leading at the moment. But when we speak about defeating Hamas, there's also a very unique opportunity at the moment, because it's also about defeating the purposes of the 7th of October massacre by Hamas. And that was mainly about stopping Israeli-Saudi normalization. So the chance is there right now, but again, with the political paralysis on the current Israeli government hands, you cannot really move to the next phase. And I think that's mainly the goal of the Hagari statement, to actually approach the Israeli public in order to create pressure on the political leadership to create any kind of a political directive for the day after.
So what has then this offensive in Gaza, this war in Gaza, what has it achieved? Well,
currently, I think that you can discuss the reduction of Hamas military capabilities. I think the last asset, from a military point of view, was to take over the Philadelphia line, the specific buffer zone separating Egypt and the Gaza Strip, the main site of smuggling of weapons. So the military, whatever the military could actually achieve to reduce the military force of Hamas, was achieved, but the military action has somewhat exhausted itself. And we also have to relate to the fact that everything that happens in Gaza right now connects to the major threat at the moment, or in the north, of a war between Hezbollah and between Israel.
Now, Hamas is more than just militants with guns. It also was the whole civic administration of the Gaza Strip. What's going to happen to that?
Well, I think there's a discussion today about differentiating or somewhat learning some lessons from the U.S. experience in Iraq and other places, and providing some kind of an amnesty to the civil servants, understanding that we are talking about governing units and separating the so-called suicidal wing of Sinwar from the civil servants and so on. But all of it is part of a reconstruction process that could only be initiated if it is connected to a broader political initiative. We spoke about who's going to govern Hamas in the day, govern Gaza in the day after instead of Hamas. We are talking about a multinational force, the involvement of regional actors. They won't come unless it's with Palestinian invitation. That's what we are hearing for them. So it's all in the end, this entire crucial reconstruction phase connects with a broader political initiative.
Now, you have called Israel's handling of the Palestinian issue a strategic asset for Iran. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, indeed. I think that, we always used to speak, especially in Israel, about which threat is more severe for Israel's future, the Palestinian or the Iranian, and we were all wrong. They are interconnected. When we speak about areas of chaos, if we are not moving forward with reconstruction in Gaza, the great starvation and destruction that we see today in Gaza, the Iranians have excelled themselves, quote unquote, in entering chaos in Yemen, in Syria, in the civil war, in Iraq, and Gaza, in this situation, can provide them with the best conditions unless we create something else. And we also relate to the offer made by President Biden to build an alliance of moderates, mainly to contain Iranian growing regional influence that can only work, again, if we create some kind of a common ground on the Palestinian issue. So you see how those two topics are intertwined, and the current paralysis by the Israeli government serves the Iranian strategic goals altogether.
Thank you very much, Gil Murciano, there of the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. Thank you for sharing your insight. And I'm now joined by Andreas Krieg from the School of Security Studies at King's College London. Now, what's your assessment of the state of Hamas military structures at this point in the Israeli campaign?
Well, I mean, to be honest, it's kind of meaningless to discuss how many fighters have been killed, how many tunnels are still intact, because as the IDF spokesperson rightly said, this is an idea, it's a movement, and that idea of armed resistance has been fueled by the war. So the war in many ways has been counterproductive. The estimates that the US intelligence has published suggest that maybe around a third of the tunnels were destroyed, but we're looking at 500 kilometers of tunnels. A third of them being destroyed means it's not really strategically viable in terms of making a difference on the ground. And in terms of estimates of how many fighters were killed, we're looking at 30%, 35% of Hamas fighters. But obviously at the same time, we've seen Hamas being able to restock most of its fighting battalions with new recruits, and hence here is where the problem comes in. I think Israel has fundamentally misunderstood the source of power for Hamas, which is the idea of armed resistance. And while Israel has failed to provide a strategic alternative to Hamas politically, it has created a thrust and a kind of a polar attraction to the movement and to the idea of armed resistance, because the desperation of people, particularly in Gaza, who've been hit, entire generations of people have been annihilated, half of infrastructure has been destroyed in Gaza. That has fueled the kind of attraction of the idea of armed resistance, because people have no alternative. And if before the 7th of October, Israel had any sort of idea or any prospect of potentially working with Palestinians, that prospect has now disappeared. Palestinians will now, when left with a choice between Israel and Hamas, will side with the Hamas, not because they like it, but because Israel is the worst of two choices.
Now, how unified is Hamas? Are there differences between the leadership in Gaza and leaders in exile, for example?
Oh, absolutely. So we've seen that from the beginning. The leaders, in particular in Qatar and also in Egypt, or in Lebanon, have very little in terms of popular support on the ground, because they've been out of the picture for many years. They have been living quite comfortably, while the leadership on the ground, particularly Daif and Sinwar, have been embedded more or less within the population on the ground, even if they're underground. But for the most part, they have actually provided a degree of attraction to people in Gaza in a way that people in exile have not. And that's kind of the difficulty. So negotiating with Hamas in Qatar, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that what is agreed will be one-to-one translated to what's going on the ground, because there's been disruption within the movement as a whole.
Now, you've touched upon this, but how much support does Hamas really have among the civilian population in Gaza and also in the West Bank?
So here, again, very difficult to have opinion polls in times of war. What we do see is a slightly different picture between the West Bank and Gaza. Obviously, people in Gaza are suffering extremely. I mean, this is one of the worst, if not the worst, humanitarian situation anywhere in the world. And while it is being caused by Israeli bombs and Israeli destruction, there are a lot of people in Gaza who are saying the root cause of that, at least, is the 7th of October for now. As such, there's a lot of people in Gaza who are blaming Hamas. On the other side, you have people in the West Bank who are not suffering that much at the moment, at least from Israeli occupation. And they feel the only way to fight back is to support Hamas in countering what they see as Israeli aggression. And in Gaza, the picture is, again, is slightly different. So I would say that Hamas is losing some support. But again, people in Palestine are left with a choice between a pest and cholera, between Israel and Hamas. And since Israel hasn't offered a viable solution out of desperation, and that would have been an opportunity here, an alternative to Hamas, people will side with Hamas because they have no other choice.
Now, if the total defeat of Hamas is not possible, what is the alternative for the IDF then?
Well, the IDF is in a difficult situation, and we're seeing increasing ruptures here between the IDF leadership and the political leadership in Jerusalem. This right-wing government of Bibi Netanyahu is not pursuing a viable political strategy. It's relying entirely on the military. And the IDF is now coming out more and more saying there is no military solution to the problem. We need a strategic pathway to self-governance to provide Palestinians with a viable solution to self-governance, not just in the West Bank, but also in Gaza. And the Israeli government is doing everything to undermine this by, empowering settlers, by empowering now new governance structures, Israeli government structures in the West Bank that further undermine the Palestinian Authority. So what needs to happen is Israel needs to think about a strategic solution. It needs to attack the root cause of the conflict, which is occupation, which is the lack of a viable solution and pathway to a two-state solution. And that has to Israel has to fundamentally change its approach to that, both means, both ways, and also its ends. I don't see that happening because Netanyahu in particular and his right-wing government have no real interest to provide Palestinians with any incentive. They want to pursue a policy of iron fist, and that is going to fail.
Andreas Krieg, there, King's College London, thank you very much.